The empath is often praised for their kindness, their sensitivity, their deep concern for others. They are called generous, intuitive, emotionally intelligent. But rarely do we ask how that empathy was formed. Rarely do we ask what it cost. Very often, the empath is not born from abundance, but from necessity. They are the child who learned early that being attentive to others was safer than attending to themselves. The child who discovered that having needs created tension, withdrawal, or punishment. The child who sensed that love was fragile, conditional, something that had to be earned by being good, helpful, understanding, quiet. Selfishness for that child was never a moral failure. It was a risk. To want too much, to ask too often, to take up space emotionally, these were dangerous acts. So the child adapted. They became watchful. They learned to read faces, tones, moods. They learned when to speak and when to disappear. Their empathy was not indulgence, it was intelligence shaped by fear. Over time, this outward focus became identity. Caring for others felt natural. Caring for the self felt wrong. Guilt emerged whenever attention turned inward. Rest felt undeserved. Boundaries felt cruel. Saying no felt like rejection. This is not personality. This is conditioning. The empath learned that connection required self-erasure. That belonging meant being useful. That love meant understanding others before being understood. And so they became experts at compassion, while remaining strangers to their own needs. What looks like generosity is often grief. Grief for the care that was never reliably given. Grief for the freedom to be spontaneous, demanding, imperfect. The empath learned to be mature far too soon, responsible far too early, emotionally available before they were emotionally supported. And yet, we celebrate this adaptation without naming the wound beneath it. Healing begins when the empath realizes that their sensitivity was shaped by circumstance, not destiny. That their exhaustion is not weakness, but the consequence of carrying too much for too long. That empathy without self-inclusion becomes self-abandonment. To heal is to learn a new definition of selfishness, one that is not about taking from others, but about returning to oneself, about listening inward with the same care once reserved for everyone else, about recognizing that needs are not threats, but signals of aliveness. This can feel deeply uncomfortable. The nervous system resists. Guilt surfaces. Old fears whisper that choosing oneself will lead to rejection or loss. But healing requires staying present through this discomfort, allowing the inner child to experience something new, permission to rest without justification, permission to say no without explanation, permission to want without shame. True empathy does not disappear when the self is included. It becomes grounded. It gains clarity. It no longer confuses understanding with endurance. Compassion becomes sustainable because it is no longer fueled by fear. The empath who heals does not become cold. They become whole. They stop giving to be loved and start loving from choice. They stop monitoring others for safety and start trusting themselves. The child who was never allowed to be selfish grows into an adult who learns that self-care is not betrayal. That presence does not require sacrifice. That love does not demand disappearance. And in that realization, empathy is no longer a survival strategy. It becomes a gift freely given, wisely held, and finally shared with the self. Empathy often begins long before it is recognized as a virtue. It does not emerge in comfort or ease, nor does it develop because a child is naturally gentle or unusually mature. More often, it takes shape in environments where safety is uncertain, where emotional climates shift without warning, and where attunement to others becomes necessary for survival. In these settings, empathy is not a choice, but an adaptation. A child learns quickly when their well-being depends on reading the room. They sense tension before words are spoken. Notice subtle changes in tone, posture, and silence. This sensitivity is not encouraged through instruction, it is learned through consequence. When expressing needs leads to dismissal, anger, or withdrawal, the child adapts by turning outward. Attention shifts from self to others, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. In unpredictable environments, awareness becomes protection. The nervous system stays alert, scanning for signs of danger or approval. The child becomes skilled at anticipating emotional shifts, adjusting behavior to maintain stability. This hyper-attunement is often praised later in life as emotional intelligence, but its origins are rooted in vigilance. What appears as empathy began as an effort to prevent harm. Survival-based empathy teaches the child to prioritize connection over authenticity. Being liked, accepted, or needed feels safer than being honest. The child learns that harmony must be preserved at all costs. even if it requires silence or self-sacrifice. Over time, this pattern solidifies. The ability to understand others grows, while the ability to understand oneself weakens. The child may receive affirmation for being helpful, calm, or mature. These labels reinforce the adaptation. Sensitivity is rewarded when it serves others, not when it serves the self. Emotional labor becomes invisible, but expected. The child learns that their value lies in how well they can manage the emotional states of those around them. As this pattern continues, empathy becomes fused with responsibility. The child feels accountable for others' feelings, believing that if someone is upset, it is their role to fix it. This belief is not logical, but it is embodied. It lives in the nervous system, shaping reactions long before conscious thought. The child becomes the peacekeeper, the listener, the one who understands. There is a cost to this form of empathy. It often requires the suppression of one's own emotion. Anger feels dangerous, sadness feels inconvenient, needs feel excessive. The child learns to tolerate discomfort quietly while offering comfort outwardly. Over time, this creates internal disconnection. The self becomes secondary to the environment. In adulthood, survival-based empathy can look like chronic overgiving. The person may struggle to set boundaries, fearing rejection or conflict. They may attract relationships that rely heavily on their emotional labor. Their sensitivity, once protective, becomes draining. Yet the original adaptation persists because it once ensured belonging. Understanding empathy as a survival skill changes the narrative. It reframes sensitivity not as weakness, but as intelligence shaped by experience. It honors the resilience required to remain emotionally open in conditions that did not consistently offer safety. The empath did not choose to be this way. They adapted in order to endure. Healing begins when this adaptation is recognized, when empathy is seen not as identity but as strategy. This recognition allows space for compassion toward the self. The behaviors that once ensured survival can be appreciated without being endlessly repeated. The nervous system can learn new responses. As healing unfolds, empathy becomes less reactive and more grounded. It is no longer driven by fear or obligation. The person learns to feel without absorbing, to understand without fixing, to care without abandoning themselves. Empathy evolves from survival mechanism into conscious choice. This transformation requires safety. The body must learn that connection no longer depends on self-erasure. Boundaries become possible when the nervous system no longer expects punishment for having needs. The person begins to listen inward with the same attention once given to others. Survival-based empathy is not something to discard. It carries insight, perception, and depth. But it must be integrated rather than allowed to dominate. When balanced with self-attunement, empathy becomes sustainable. It retains its sensitivity without exhausting the giver. Recognizing the origins of empathy invites a new kind of respect for those who feel deeply. It acknowledges the strength required to remain emotionally present in the face of uncertainty. It validates the intelligence of adaptation while opening the door to transformation. Empathy that began as survival does not have to remain in that role. With awareness, safety, and self-compassion, it can become something freer. It can shift from vigilance to presence, from obligation to choice, from coping to connection. Selfishness was not always understood as a moral failing by the child who learned to fear it. It was experienced as danger, as something that threatened connection, safety, and belonging. In many early environments, expressing needs did not lead to care, but to tension, dismissal, punishment. Wanting more time, more attention, more space was met with withdrawal or criticism. The child learned quickly that self-focus carried consequences, and so selfishness became associated not with choice, but with risk. In such environments, the message was rarely spoken directly. It was communicated through reactions, silences, and emotional shifts. A child asking for comfort might be met with irritation. A child asserting preference might be labeled difficult. A child expressing exhaustion might be told to be grateful. Over time, the nervous system absorbed these responses as truth. It learned that turning inward disrupted harmony and invited disconnection. What developed was not humility, but hypervigilance. The child became careful, scanning constantly to ensure that their presence did not burden others. Needs were edited before being expressed. Desires were delayed indefinitely. Selfishness was no longer about taking too much. It was about taking anything at all. The safest option became invisibility. This conditioning shaped behavior at a fundamental level. The child learned to associate goodness with compliance and love with usefulness. They discovered that attending to others brought praise, while attending to themselves brought discomfort. Over time, this created an internal rule: care flows outward, never inward. Self-consideration was equated with harm. As the child matured, this rule hardened into identity. Being selfless became a defining trait. Saying yes felt natural. Saying no felt wrong. The idea of prioritizing personal needs evoked guilt and anxiety. Even rest required justification. Pleasure felt indulgent. Boundaries felt cruel. These reactions were not choices. They were reflexes shaped by early learning. In adulthood, the consequences became clearer. Relationships often revolved around giving and accommodating. Emotional labor was offered freely but rarely reciprocated. The individual might feel unseen or depleted but struggle to articulate why. The belief that self-focus was dangerous remained embedded, even when the original threat was no longer present. This dynamic often led to resentment, though it was rarely acknowledged. The person gave without limits, then felt hurt when others took without awareness. Yet asking for change felt unsafe. The internalized warning remained: asserting needs could cost connection. The fear was not abstract. It lived in the body, echoing earlier experiences. Understanding this pattern requires compassion rather than judgment. The child did not reject selfishness out of virtue. They avoided it out of necessity. Their environment taught them that self-advocacy endangered attachment. The adaptation made sense. It preserved relationships that felt essential to survival. Selfishness, in this context, was never explored as a choice. It was never framed as balance or self-respect. It was defined narrowly, stripped of nuance, and loaded with threat. The child was not taught that one could care for others while caring for oneself. The two were presented as opposites, forcing a false dilemma. Healing begins when this framing is questioned, when the adult recognizes that what was once dangerous may now be necessary. The nervous system must learn that prioritizing the self no longer leads to abandonment. This learning takes time. It requires repeated experiences of safety, boundaries, and self-trust. As awareness grows, the individual may notice how deeply ingrained the fear remains. Small acts of self-care can trigger disproportionate guilt. Saying no may bring waves of anxiety. These reactions are not signs of selfishness. They are remnants of old conditioning. They reflect how thoroughly the message was absorbed. Reframing selfishness is a crucial step. It becomes possible to see it not as harm but as agency, not as rejection of others, but as inclusion of the self. This shift allows for a more accurate understanding of responsibility. One is not responsible for managing everyone else as emotion. One is responsible for honoring one's own limits. When selfishness is reclaimed as choice, relationships change. Giving becomes intentional rather than compulsive. Care becomes mutual rather than one-sided. The individual can offer support without disappearing. This balance creates healthier connections, even if it initially disrupts familiar patterns. There may be resistance from others accustomed to the old dynamic. Boundaries can be misinterpreted as withdrawal. Self-prioritization can be labeled selfishness by those who benefited from its absence. These reactions can reinforce old fears, but they also reveal the cost of the previous arrangement. Choosing oneself after a lifetime of avoidance is not an act of aggression. It is an act of repair. It acknowledges the child who learned to stay small to stay safe. It offers that child a new experience that needs can be expressed without catastrophe, that care does not vanish when the self is included. Selfishness, once stripped of its threat, reveals its true nature. It is the capacity to choose alignment over appeasement, presence over performance, truth over fear. It is not excess, it is balance. It is not danger, it is discernment. When reclaimed consciously, it becomes the foundation for genuine compassion rather than its enemy. The shift from danger to choice does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually through moments of listening inward, of honoring discomfort, of staying present through guilt without obeying it. Each small choice rewrites the old narrative. Each act of self-respect weakens the association between selfhood and loss. What was once forbidden becomes possible. What was once feared becomes grounding. The child who learned to survive by disappearing learns finally that taking up space does not threaten love. It allows it to exist on truer terms. Emotional attunement often begins as a strength, but for many it develops at the expense of something equally essential. When attention is consistently directed outward, inward awareness gradually fades. The ability to sense, name, and respond to one's own internal states becomes secondary to monitoring the emotions of others. This shift does not happen by accident. It is learned in environments where self-attunement felt unsafe or irrelevant, and where emotional survival depended on attuning to someone else. In early life, self-attunement grows when a child, as feelings are noticed, reflected, and responded to. When this does not occur consistently, the child adapts. Instead of learning to listen inward, they learn to listen outward. They begin to track moods, anticipate needs, and adjust behavior accordingly. Their internal signals are overridden in favor of external cues. Over time, this outward focus becomes automatic. The child learns that paying attention to their own feelings does not lead to relief. Expressing sadness may be ignored. Expressing anger may be punished. Expressing fear may be minimized. The message absorbed is not that feelings are wrong, but that they are ineffective. As a result, the child stops consulting them. Emotional energy is redirected toward managing the environment rather than understanding the self. This adaptation creates emotional competence that is often praised. The child appears mature, intuitive, and considerate. They are skilled at soothing others and maintaining harmony. What goes unseen is the internal cost. Their own emotions remain unprocessed, unnamed, and unmet. Self-attunement, which requires safety and permission, never fully develops. As emotional attunement replaces self-attunement, identity begins to form around responsiveness rather than authenticity. The individual becomes who others need them to be. They sense what is expected and perform accordingly. Over time, this performance feels natural, even necessary. The question, "What do I feel?" is replaced by, "What do they need?" This pattern continues into adulthood. The person may be highly empathetic, deeply perceptive, and emotionally available, yet they may struggle to identify their own needs or preferences. Decision-making becomes difficult. Boundaries feel confusing. Exhaustion becomes chronic. The body signals distress, but without a developed relationship to those signals, they are often ignored. Emotional attunement without self-attunement leads to imbalance. The individual becomes a container for others' emotions, while remaining disconnected from their own. This imbalance is often reinforced by relationships that rely on their availability. The person is valued for their support, not their presence. Their inner world remains secondary. The nervous system adapts to this role. Hypervigilance becomes the norm. The body stays alert, scanning for emotional shifts in others. This constant monitoring leaves little space for rest or self-reflection. The individual may feel anxious without knowing why, overwhelmed without clear cause. Their system is working continuously, even in stillness. Healing begins with recognizing this replacement. Emotional attunement does not need to disappear. It needs to be balanced. The capacity to sense others is not the problem. The absence of self-attunement is. Reclaiming it requires slowing down and turning attention inward, often for the first time. This process can feel disorienting. Without familiar external cues, the individual may feel uncertain or empty. Learning to identify internal states takes practice. Feelings that were once suppressed may surface with intensity. This is not regression, it is reconnection. The self that was deferred begins to speak. Developing self-attunement involves listening to the body, noticing sensations, and respecting limits. It means treating discomfort as information rather than inconvenience. It requires patience, as the nervous system learns that inward focus is no longer dangerous. Safety must be established internally before it can be trusted externally. As self-attunement grows, emotional attunement becomes less compulsive. The individual can sense others without absorbing them. They can respond without abandoning themselves. Empathy becomes grounded rather than draining. Relationships begin to shift. Some deepen through mutual presence. Others fade when emotional labor is no longer freely offered. This shift can evoke guilt or fear. The old belief that one must attend to others to be worthy may resurface. Staying present with this discomfort is part of integration. It allows new patterns to form. Self-attunement becomes a source of regulation rather than threat. Over time, the individual experiences a more coherent sense of self. Decisions align with internal signals. Boundaries become clearer. Energy is conserved rather than depleted. Emotional attunement remains, but it no longer overrides self-awareness. Reclaiming self-attunement does not diminish compassion. It refines it. The individual can offer presence without overextension. They can listen without losing themselves. This balance creates sustainable connection. When emotional attunement replaces self-attunement, survival is prioritized over authenticity. Healing restores the balance. It allows the individual to remain sensitive to others while finally being present with himself. Overgiving rarely begins as generosity alone. It begins as a strategy for connection, a way to secure belonging in environments where acceptance felt uncertain. When love, attention, or safety were inconsistent, giving became a means of anchoring oneself in relationship. The child learned that being useful, helpful, or accommodating increased the chances of being included. Over time, giving stopped being an expression of abundance and became a condition for belonging. In early relationships, children naturally seek connection. When that connection feels fragile, they adapt. If emotional availability is met with withdrawal, the child looks for other ways to stay close. They offer help. They stay quiet. They anticipate needs. These behaviors are not conscious choices. They are responses to relational cues. Overgiving becomes a form of communication, signaling worth through service rather than presence. This pattern is often reinforced. The child who gives is praised. They are called mature, considerate, dependable. These labels become part of identity. The message absorbed is clear. Giving earns approval. Needing does not. Over time, the child learns to suppress their own desires in favor of meeting others. Belonging becomes transactional, measured by output rather than mutuality. As this adaptation solidifies, boundaries blur. The child struggles to distinguish between generosity and obligation. Saying yes feels automatic. Saying no feels dangerous. Overgiving is no longer something they do, it is who they are. The body becomes accustomed to constant output, even when depleted. Rest feels undeserved. Receiving feels uncomfortable. In adulthood, this pattern continues. The overgiver may attract relationships that rely heavily on their availability. They become the emotional support, the problem solver, the reliable one. Their presence is valued, but often in relation to what they provide. When they stop giving, connection feels threatened. This reinforces the belief that belonging is conditional. Overgiving also distorts self-worth. Value becomes externally defined. The person feels good when they are needed and invisible when they are not. Their sense of identity fluctuates with others' demands. This instability creates anxiety. The drive to give increases not out of generosity but out of fear of disconnection. There is often resentment beneath overgiving. It remains unspoken, as acknowledging it feels disloyal or ungrateful. The person may feel taken for granted but struggles to assert needs. They continue to give, hoping that eventually the effort will be recognized. This hope keeps the cycle alive. Understanding overgiving as a strategy for belonging shifts the narrative. It replaces self-criticism with compassion. The overgiver was not foolish or weak. They were adaptive. They found a way to stay connected in environments that did not offer unconditional acceptance. Giving became a bridge to safety. Healing begins when this strategy is questioned, when the individual notices that overgiving no longer serves them. Awareness brings discomfort. Reducing output can feel like betrayal. The fear of being forgotten or abandoned resurfaces. These reactions reveal how deeply belonging was tied to performance. Relearning belonging requires new experiences. The individual must test the possibility that connection can exist without overextension. This involves setting limits, expressing needs, and allowing others to show up. Each small act of self-respect challenges the old belief that giving is the price of admission. As boundaries are introduced, relationships change. Some adapt and become more balanced. Others falter when the familiar flow of giving is interrupted. These outcomes are informative. They reveal which connections were rooted in mutuality and which depended on imbalance. Overgiving also affects the body. Chronic fatigue, tension, and emotional numbness are common. The nervous system has been trained to stay active, alert, and responsive. Healing invites rest, but rest can feel unsafe at first. Slowing down exposes the fear beneath the habit. With time, the individual learns to differentiate generosity from compulsion. Giving becomes a choice rather than a requirement. They learn to give from fullness rather than emptiness. Belonging shifts from something earned to something experienced. This shift does not eliminate care for others. It refines it. The overgiver can still be kind, supportive, and attentive. But these qualities are no longer tied to self-erasure. They coexist with self-respect. Belonging rooted in overgiving is fragile. It depends on constant output. Belonging rooted in authenticity is stable. It allows presence without performance. The transition between the two is challenging, but it is also liberating. Releasing overgiving does not mean becoming indifferent. It means reclaiming balance. It means allowing connection to be mutual rather than one-sided. It means recognizing that true belonging does not require depletion. It allows the individual to exist as they are, not only for what they provide. For many people, the idea of having needs carries an unexpected weight. It is not neutral. It is charged with memory, emotion, and fear. Needs were not always welcomed. They were often inconvenient, misunderstood, or met with withdrawal. Over time, the expression of need became associated with disappointment or rejection. Healing begins when this association is questioned and the right to have needs is slowly reclaimed. Needs are not learned, they are inherent. From the beginning, the body signals hunger, fatigue, discomfort, and desire for closeness. When these signals are met with responsiveness, a sense of safety develops. When they are ignored or punished, the nervous system adapts. The child does not stop having needs. They stop expressing them. This adaptation preserves connection at the cost of self-awareness. In such environments, the child learns that attention flows outward. They learn to sense what others require and adjust accordingly. Their own needs become secondary, then invisible. Over time, this pattern hardens into belief. Wanting feels excessive. Asking feels risky. Relying on others feels unsafe. Independence becomes a shield rather than a choice. Adulthood often reveals the cost of this adaptation. The individual may struggle with exhaustion, resentment, or emptiness without understanding why. They give freely but feel unseen. They care deeply but feel unsupported. The underlying issue is not lack of generosity, but lack of permission to need. Healing reintroduces this permission. It begins with awareness. The person starts to notice internal signals that were long ignored. Fatigue is recognized instead of overridden. Emotional discomfort is acknowledged instead of dismissed. These moments are small, but they are significant. They mark the return of self-attunement. This process is rarely comfortable. Allowing needs to surface can trigger guilt or anxiety. Old beliefs resurface, warning that expressing need will lead to loss. The nervous system remembers past outcomes and reacts accordingly. Healing requires staying present through this fear without obeying it. Reclaiming the right to have needs does not mean demanding or depending excessively on others. It means recognizing that needs exist regardless of whether they are met. Ignoring them does not eliminate them, it displaces them. Healing brings them back into awareness so they can be addressed with clarity. As needs are acknowledged, boundaries become necessary. The individual learns to differentiate between what they can give and what they cannot. This differentiation is not selfish. It is respectful. It prevents resentment and burnout. It allows care to be sustainable rather than sacrificial. Healing also changes how support is received. Many who learn to suppress needs struggle to accept help. Receiving feels unfamiliar, even threatening. The impulse is to minimize or deflect. Healing invites the individual to stay present with receiving, to tolerate vulnerability without retreating. This experience challenges the belief that needing leads to harm. As the right to have needs is reclaimed, identity shifts. The individual no longer defines themselves solely by what they provide. They begin to see themselves as worthy of care without performance. This shift can feel destabilizing. It removes a familiar source of validation, yet it creates space for authenticity. Relationships inevitably change. Some deepen as mutuality replaces imbalance. Others struggle when the old dynamic is disrupted. These changes are not failures. They reflect a new alignment. Healing clarifies what is sustainable and what is not. Reclaiming needs also affects the body. Chronic tension begins to release as the nervous system learns that self-expression is safe. Rest becomes restorative rather than guilt-inducing. Pleasure becomes accessible. These changes reflect a deeper sense of permission to exist fully. Healing does not eliminate needs. It integrates them. It allows them to be communicated, negotiated, and honored. This integration supports resilience. When needs are acknowledged, the individual can respond proactively rather than reactively. There's a quiet dignity in recognizing one's needs. It affirms humanity. It counters the belief that worth is conditional. It acknowledges that interdependence is natural. Healing restores this truth without romanticizing dependence. Reclaiming the right to have needs is not a single decision. It is a practice. Each time a need is noticed and respected, the old narrative weakens. Each act of self-attunement builds trust. Over time, the individual learns that caring for themselves does not diminish their capacity to care for others. It enhances it. Healing reclaims what was never meant to be surrendered. The right to need, to ask, to receive is not indulgence. It is restoration. Empathy is often described as the ability to feel with others, to sense their emotional states and respond with care. In many people, especially those shaped by early responsibility or emotional neglect, empathy becomes one-directional. Attention flows outward, tuned finely to others, moods, needs, and unspoken cues. This outward focus is praised as kindness and emotional intelligence, yet it often conceals a quiet absence. The self is missing from the empathic field. True empathy is not self-erasure. It is inclusion. It requires awareness of one's own internal experience alongside awareness of others. When empathy excludes the self, it becomes a survival strategy rather than a relational skill. The nervous system learns to scan the environment for signals of threat or approval, prioritizing harmony over authenticity. This pattern develops early when emotional safety depends on managing others rather than being met. In such conditions, the child becomes highly perceptive. They sense shifts in tone, posture, and mood. They learn to anticipate needs before they are spoken. What is often called empathy is, at its core, vigilance. It is not rooted in choice but in necessity. The cost of this adaptation is internal silence. The child's own feelings recede from awareness because attending to them offers no protection. As adulthood unfolds, this pattern persists. The person may identify strongly as empathetic, compassionate, or emotionally attuned. They may be the one others lean on, confide in, or rely upon. Yet beneath this role lies fatigue, resentment, or numbness. These signals are not signs of insufficient empathy. They are signs of imbalance. When empathy excludes the self, boundaries blur. The individual struggles to differentiate between their emotions and those of others. Distress becomes contagious. Responsibility expands beyond what is realistic. Saying no feels like betrayal. Rest feels undeserved. Over time, the nervous system remains in a state of activation, always oriented outward. Healing reframes empathy as a two-way process. The individual begins to notice their own sensations, emotions, and limits while remaining aware of others. This inclusion feels unfamiliar and, at times, uncomfortable. Old beliefs surface, suggesting that self-attention is selfish or uncaring. These beliefs are remnants of earlier conditioning, not reflections of truth. True empathy requires presence. Presence cannot be sustained without self-awareness. When the self is absent, empathy becomes performative or compulsive. When the self is included, empathy becomes grounded. The individual can feel with another without losing themselves. They can care without overextending. They can listen without absorbing. Including the self also changes how emotions are processed. Instead of immediately responding to others' feelings, the individual pauses to check inward. What am I feeling right now? What is mine? What belongs to the other? This differentiation reduces overwhelm and increases clarity. It allows for responses that are intentional rather than reflexive. As self-empathy develops, the individual learns to recognize their own distress with the same compassion they offer others. Fatigue is not dismissed. Hurt is not minimized. Anger is not automatically suppressed. These emotions are treated as information rather than inconvenience. This shift restores internal trust. Relationships begin to change. When empathy includes the self, patterns of overgiving soften. The individual no longer equates love with depletion. They can offer support without abandoning their own needs. This often reveals which relationships are reciprocal and which relied on imbalance. Some connections deepen, others become strained. These changes reflect increased honesty rather than loss of care. Self-inclusive empathy also alters communication. Needs are expressed more clearly. Limits are stated earlier. The individual no longer waits until resentment builds. This clarity can feel risky at first. It challenges the old belief that harmony must be maintained at all costs. Over time, it creates healthier dynamics. The body responds to this shift. Chronic tension eases as the nervous system exits constant vigilance. Rest becomes possible. Emotional regulation improves. These physiological changes reflect the restoration of internal safety. The self is no longer neglected in service of connection. It is important to distinguish self-empathy from self-absorption. Including the self does not mean centering every interaction around personal experience. It means acknowledging internal reality as valid and relevant. It means not disappearing in the presence of others' emotions. This balance supports genuine connection. True empathy also requires choice. When empathy is driven by fear of conflict or abandonment, it is not freely given. Including the self restores agency. The individual can decide when and how to engage. They can step back when needed without guilt. This choice makes empathy sustainable. As healing progresses, the individual may grieve the years spent neglecting themselves. This grief is part of integration. It honors what was sacrificed for survival. It also affirms a new way of relating, one that does not require self-erasure. Empathy that includes the self is quieter and steadier. It does not rush to fix or rescue. It listens without losing center. It recognizes that caring for others and caring for oneself are not opposing forces, but complementary ones. When the self is present, empathy becomes an expression of wholeness rather than a response to fear.